Chair of Governors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure on behalf of the whole university to welcome you here this evening for Ryan Lavelle's professorial lecture. My name is Joy Carter, Professor Joy Carter, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the university. Inaugural professorial lectures are a great opportunity for the university to celebrate the outstanding work of our academics, and we love them. The academics and the lectures. This evening, it's my huge pleasure to introduce Ryan Lavelle, the world's go-to expert on the House of Wessex, and someone who's been part of our community for over 20 years. So this is a little story about how Ryan got to be standing in front of you today. So back to his childhood. He had a childhood spent first in Lancashire and then in Somerset. Speed forward, Ryan read history at Royal Holloway. And interestingly, his love of history grew out of days spent wandering around nearby Astley Hall, a stately home in Chorley. Around the same time, Ryan developed a love for war games, a hobby that continues to this day. Ryan took his hobby very seriously. When he was at sixth form college, he ran a hugely successful business, making model war vehicles used in wargaming. A man of many talents. He had customers all over the world. During his undergraduate days, Ryan shifted from a passion for modern history, born out of his wargaming hobby, to a passion for medieval history. And he was encouraged in this, partly by his tutor at Royal Holloway. Ryan moved to York to undertake a master's degree in medieval studies. During his time there, and inspired by the local Viking history, Ryan also picked up an interest in archaeology. And this is a skill which has helped with his research career ever since. Over breakfast, one morning towards the end of his master's degree, Ryan spotted an advertisement for a medieval studentship at Winchester's King Alfred College. So he made the move from one of the North's finest historic cities to one of the South's finest historic cities. Maybe the finest historic city. And so began a remarkable and successful academic career that paved the way to Ryan becoming a leading expert in the Anglo-Saxon period. Ryan has published seminal works on King Alfred and King Canute. He's also become the go-to expert on the period, most notably as the historical advisor on the BBC's major historical series. Many of you will know this one, The Last Kingdom. His time here at Winchester University hasn't just been marked by academic success. When he was a doctoral student, Ryan became very familiar with the process of interlibrary loans. Why, you say? Was this to deepen his knowledge and enhance his research, or was something else going on? Perhaps it might have had a little to do with the lovely interlibrary loans assistant at the time. Either way, the interlibrary loans assistant, Janine, and Ryan are now married. And together with their two boys, Sam and Ben, they live in Winchester. And that's lovely. We are delighted to welcome the whole family here tonight for this very special occasion. Ryan, it's an absolute pleasure to have you part of Team Winchester. We're delighted to work alongside you, and we're really looking forward to your talk this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving Professor Ryan Lavelle the warmest welcome.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you for the very kind introduction there. And I couldn't quite bring it in me when I saw the draft of that to edit the world's go-to expert. I felt maybe modesty kind of meant that I ought to, but I quite liked the sound of that and left it there. But thank you everybody for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here to hear me talk about a subject which I love. And I'm starting, you might think with the image here behind me as the backdrop for the slide, this image of William the Conqueror, William the Bastard of Normandy, as he's known in the mid-11th century, Duke of Normandy, later King of England. And this is a statue, a 19th century statue at Falaise in Normandy. I'm not going to say anything particular about Falaise, but it's a nice image to use here to kind of encapsulate some of the themes of my lecture, because it's got that sense of seizing power, because he's grasping a spear, a gonfalon, as it's known, and also the keeping power, because William was tenacious through his reign, and you'll hear something about that. But I was thinking about the other part of the title, kicking up a fuss, and I suppose the horse is kicking quite nicely. But the fuss, I was just thinking of the controversy here, the controversy of doing a lecture on the early Middle Ages in Winchester, using a statue for that image, and that image is not King Alfred. So, oh dear, I think that might be the fuss in some ways here. But watch out for Alfred, he does appear in what I have to say. And basically what I'm working on, and I do promise my publishers that I'm going to deliver the final version of the book. What I am working on is the notion of the contesting of power in the early Middle Ages. And I'm interested in where that takes place and where power is contested. I'm interested in this as a topic. And the book is focusing on that contesting of power, specifically rebellions and internal conflicts, the kinds of things that Ælfric of Eynsham refers to as the endless sorrow of the miserableness and the endless sorrow of civil war. And in some senses, that is part of what I'm focusing on tonight. I'm not going to deal with things quite in the order of the title, so there'll be some seizing of power, and then some kicking up a fuss, and then I'll move on to the keeping power at the end. So I'm drawing from some of the things that I've been working on recently, and but it's a topic that I've been working on, as colleagues will attest, for some years, nearly a decade actually. I started on this in 2010, and there is a sense, I got that sort of sense that somehow inadvertently I was working on the cutting edge of medieval history that's kind of relating to the world events. And as I started working on this in 2010, I realized through no planning, obviously no planning, but 2010 happened to be the point when world events sort of started to move, where you get the beginning of the protest that later became known as the Arab Spring, and the use of central places, the use of public places like Tahrir Square in Cairo as places where protests happen and where power is contested in many ways. And this isn't a sort of spurious attempt to go, hey kids, medieval history is really interesting and really relevant, but it's simply a matter of relating the point that these themes are constants. These themes are themes which emerge again and again throughout different historical periods. So that contestation of power through central places is something which has been kind of brimming there in the background as I've been working on this topic. Another thing that's there, my children are in the audience. I'm going to take the hat off. Remind me to put it on again at the end, because otherwise I won't become a professor if I don't walk out the room with a hat on. The other thing is that my children are in the audience, and I did promise them an image here that's relevant to the period in which I've been working on this book. 2015 saw the rebooting of the Star Wars franchise. And there is a kind of spurious medieval connection here, because medieval sources make a distinction between the word rebellion, or to rebel, and to resist. And interestingly, in the Star Wars series, the rebellion has shifted to becoming the resistance. I never quite understand why, but maybe if I do understand, that will help me to understand the medieval sources there. So what I'm trying to do in my work is become more than an Anglo-Saxonist, more than somebody who focuses simply on Anglo-Saxon pre-conquest England. And I've been looking at things in a comparative setting. I've been looking at England and France. I mean, this isn't global history by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a hop, skip, and jump across the channel. But trying to look at events that happen in pre-conquest England in the context of what's also going on in France in the same period, West Francia, as it's sometimes known in the sources. And part of what I'm trying to do stems from that sense of trying to understand things more contextually, to think of, and I realise the ground is shifting under me as I speak in this, but to think of England in a European context, and this is part of what I'm trying to do in my work. So I'm only going to be able to provide a few snippets here this evening, little snippets of history of different events, but some of the comparisons are quite interesting. There is a whole bunch of places. This is the kind of what I look at kind of map, which is to go at the beginning of the book. But I'm, as you can probably work out, going to focus on the ringed places. Wimborne Minster in Dorset, Arques-la-Bataille in Normandy, Laon, Winchester's twin town. Incidentally, that's a modern thing rather than a medieval thing, but Laon in northern France, and also Winchester itself. And these are snippets of medieval episodes, basically, and I think there are fuller stories. There is a fuller story of the Civil War between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda, which ranges across the Channel, for example. There is, of course, the story of the Norman Conquest and the resistance to the Norman Conquest in England, and all these are bigger narratives. And I'm only providing snippets. But look out for the book next year, and you'll be able to pick up the whole thing. This does relate to my development, my career as a historian in Winchester. When I came to Winchester in 1997, it was to study royal estates in Wessex and to look at places in the context of Anglo-Saxon charters, Domesday Book, to look at the history, the legal history, the tenurial history, those kinds of issues. And those were all very interesting. And you get things like a map of a system known as the Farm of One Night, recorded in Domesday Book in the 11th century, which is an indication of types of land which are providing for the king and the royal family as they move around the kingdom. And I got very interested in that for a while, possibly too long. But at the end of the first year of studies, in the summer of the first year of studies, my supervisor, who's here tonight, Professor Barbara York, advised me to get out, and not literally to get out, but advised me to get out and look at these places. And so, with the goodwill of my mother, who is also here tonight, I borrowed my mum's Suzuki Jeep and sort of hiked here, there, and everywhere, and sort of got up some different highways and byways. And I must apologise for some of the dents on the car as a result of some of that. But I got to go to places and look at these places in their landscape context. And I think that was very important, to actually see those connections and see those landscape connections, sometimes the prehistoric past as well, but also just get a sense, get a feel for the land. And that was a very valuable lesson to me. And what it also did, it was brought to life some of the episodes in early medieval history. And an episode which has stayed with me, stayed through my career with me, is an episode with Æthelwold, the nephew of King Alfred, who makes a bid for power following the death of King Alfred in 899. See, I was going to mention King Alfred, there he is. And he goes to, first he goes to Christ Church in Dorset, and then travels up to Wimborne Minster in Dorset, and it's a kind of fascinating landscape relationship between these two sites. And what it did for me was it really made the royal estates come alive, because Wimborne was part of a complex of estates providing a provision of farm of one night. So it meant a great deal in terms of the royal family. It was also the place where Æthelwold's father, Ethelred I, a brother of King Alfred, was buried, and he'd been buried there in 871. And Æthelwold was probably too young in 871 to succeed, so Alfred succeeded. But by the time of Alfred's death, Æthelwold had grown up and probably expected to be king. And you get this process at the end of Alfred's life, is the setting up of a royal dynasty that excludes, that pushes out Æthelwold and his brother. And Æthelwold's use of royal estates was part of a kind of language of declaring his legitimacy in many ways. His cousin, who became Edward the Elder, the King Edward the Elder, son of Alfred, responded by using the prehistoric hill fort of Badbury Rings, which also happened to be the meeting place of the Hundred. So it was an important assembly point in the landscape as well. So you've got this kind of use of the landscape as a kind of language of expression. And basically Edward is responding by pointing out his legitimacy against that of Æthelwold. And the story does go on. Æthelwold wasn't successful in Wimborne. He closed the gates of Wimborne and declared that he would live there or die there, but actually he decided to sneak away during the night. And that's the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the West Saxon version of the history that's basically playing down Æthelwold's power and his legitimacy in many ways. And it's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as Barbara and I, we supervised a research student called Courtney Conshew, who's not here this evening, but she works in Canada now, but she worked on the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and highlighted these little formulas in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for their meaning, and that the phrase "live there or die there" is a very significant point within that text there in terms of expressing the disapproval of Æthelwold. So Æthelwold sneaks away, but he goes on to become a centre of resistance against Edward the Elder, and basically, though he's rather unsuccessful, he does survive for a while, and there's a focus of opposition to Wessex, and that determines the shape of the West Saxon kingdom, and in fact determines the shape of the English kingdom during the 10th century in many ways. Now this figure has been a great deal of interest, had a great deal of interest to me, not just because of the academic side of things, but because of the brilliant portrayal in the Last Kingdom TV series by the supporting figure of Harry McIntyre, who basically portrayed this frustrated prince within the West Saxon royal family. I think the Last Kingdom TV series kind of plays down the resources that a prince of the West Saxon royal house would probably have had, makes him a lot less wealthy and influential than he probably would have been. But I think that's part of the storyline in many ways. I didn't have much success in persuading them to get Wimborne Minster into the story. But it was quite interesting to meet Harry McIntyre and sort of explain my work on this figure. And it was one of those moments where he said, "You have a captive audience here." So, I was able to bore him for at least 10 minutes on the subject. And so this kind of topic of the way in which somebody is kind of pushed out of a ruling family has repercussions. It has important political repercussions in the early Middle Ages. And I have an interesting comparison, at least I think it's interesting, with Arc-la-Bataille in Normandy. So the castle of Arc is the home of, or was the home, I should say, of William of Arc, who was the uncle of Duke William of Normandy. So he's known as Count William. William of Normandy is known as Duke William, and they're written about by authors who were also called William. It gets a bit confusing. He's getting sidelined around about 1053 by his nephew's marriage to the daughter of the Count of Flanders to the north. And I think there is also this kind of political sense of getting pushed out of the way and needing to push back effectively. And William of Arc uses the reinforcement of his castle as a way of resisting the authority of the Duke of Normandy. And Arc-la-Bataille is a place with links to the landscape around it. The landscape is linked to the stories associated with the founding matriarch of the Norman ducal family, Gunnar, and there's a significance in the use of the estates there. And it's a fascinating area. It's well worth a visit, by the way. I've enjoyed many conversations with Sarah Fry, who's a research student of Catherine Weikert, and Catherine has a lot to say about castles as well, and Sarah has a lot to say about this particular region where she's studying another Norman family at this time. But it's that kind of crisscrossing of different relationships is an important part of the story of 11th century Normandy. But I kind of started with that issue of seizing power, but what this basically becomes, because this turned into open conflict with the King of France in support of William of Arc, not in support of the Duke of Normandy. It turns into open conflict, and it doesn't end well for William of Arc. He ends up being exiled to northern France. But is this an attempt to seize power? Or is this kicking up a fuss, the kicking up a fuss part of the lecture title? And in many ways, it is the kicking up a fuss that is significant here. Using sites in the landscape to make your political point. And this is something that I've been banging on about for a few years now. And I have colleagues in the audience who will recognize this next slide, which is a slide that I used when I first started working on this topic, which was about the use of sites and the choice of the use of a site. So a marginal location, people aren't going to be aware of what you're up to. At a central place, people become aware of what you're up to and what your grievances are. And my sort of experience as a parent had definitely played into the way I was reading some of these things. A few years later, I still hadn't written the book, and I was still presenting on this topic. And Janine doesn't know this, but we had to have another child in order for me to be able to demonstrate this a few years later as well. So I'm joking, by the way, Ben, that wasn't your sole purpose in life. Although some rebellions, I do recognise some of those rebellions in many ways. So particular sites are part of a political language in many ways. German scholars have been saying this for some years, actually, and they'd recognise this with Brisach am Rhein an important Rhine crossing point, which was a place of contested power on a few occasions in the 10th and 11th centuries. It's significant as a place of rebellion. Now, I must pay at least lip service to Matthew Bennett, who's here in the audience and who's read some of my comments about this and has been this kind of voice of reason of saying river crossing points are important strategically. Don't just think of these things as symbolic, but they have strategic significance. And I've always had to bear that in mind as well. So a river crossing point has a kind of practical purpose as well as a symbolic purpose. But this aspect of holding assemblies at places, at nodes in the landscape is significant. Gloucester, Langtree 100 is important in 1051 when the Godwin family are kicking up a fuss against Edward the Confessor at a particular point of rebellion in the 1050s as well. So here's another. These are other hundredal boundaries. I'm grateful to Stuart Brooks for that data there. And basically what's going on there is the setting up of an alternative meeting place that is contesting power with the king's assembly place at Gloucester in 1051. So that idea of assembly places and contested assemblies, I think, is quite important here. And now I'm moving on to the city of Laon in northern France. And this actually has a history of a serious uprising, an uprising by a crowd in 1112. And it's really only in the 12th century when we start to get records of popular uprisings in many towns and cities in Western Europe. I'm not actually going to focus on that. I'm going to think about the 10th century, this point of contested power in the 10th century, where Laon becomes this kind of place of power, of demonstrating power by Carolingian rulers and would-be Carolingian rulers. So Louis IV of France, Louis d'Outremer, who was basically raised in England, overseas, basically. He was the son of an English mother, the sister of Athelstan, and he was. He went back to France and used Laon as the sort of demonstrable place of authority, and it's got an enormous strategic importance. It kind of dominates the plains around it. And you've got this sort of wonderful narrative presented by Flodoard of Reims, a local chronicler of the mid-10th century, recording the conflicts between Louis and the magnates. And the case that I'm going to deal with here is Raoul of Burgundy, who was effectively part of a usurping family in the early 10th century, in his conflict with the local magnate Count Heribert II, who was a regional big man, basically. So this is about the conflict for the region around this central point. And basically in 927, there was a synod held at Trolly, which you can see on the left of the screen there, where 6 bishops come, all very straightforward. You hold a synod, bishops come to synods. That's quite straightforward. But for the fact that the Archbishop of Reims, who was holding this synod, happened to be 7 years old. At a distinctly uncanonical age of 5, he was appointed to that archiepiscopate because he was the son of Heribert II. This counts. So you've got this kind of remarkable kind of nepotism going on here. The king, funnily enough, Flodoard tells us, refused to attend this assemblies. Refused to come to this synod and sort of grant it legitimacy, as well he might. I mean, presumably he didn't want to be stuck watching episodes of Octonauts or whatever. So There's this kind of landscape context, however, that I think is probably more significant than my reckoning there. It's Coucy, the castle of Coucy, which is overlooking Trolly, which I think is quite interesting, because Coucy was an archiepiscopal holding of Reims, so it's part of the archbishop's holdings, and it's a remarkable place. It's a 10th century fortress on a hill, and like Laon, it basically dominates the area around it, and it overlooks Trolly, and it controls that zone. And basically, Trolly in the Soissonnais, in the region to the west on the map, is the closest that you can get to Coucy without being in the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Laon. So it's quite a clever bit of placement for that. And Coucy was within the archiepiscopal jurisdiction of Reims, but the other thing is that it remained within the Lannoy region. So it's remaining within a region, incidentally a region that Heribert was claiming for another son as well. So it gets very complicated in terms of these rivalries, these distinct rivalries. An irony of this occasion was that an earlier synod at Trolly had been used to give an exhortation to kings to do their duty to bishops. So I think you can tell this kind of language that's going on in the use of the places. So if the Archbishop of Reims was quite literally Heribert's creature, for Heribert to contest royal power in this way, it made sense to invoke the earlier council and try to remind the king of his subordination to the archbishop. So it's a site well chosen, basically. This is contested power, but it's not an attempt to supplant the king. The king is refusing to attend. Heribert returns the favour by refusing to go to another assembly down the road, just off the map on the west at Compiègne later that year. So there's a kind of remarkable set of action and counteraction going on in what they're doing. And you're getting the entrenchment of both figures within this conflict, all regarding the conflict for the control of Laon and the region around it. So I'm getting to this issue of rebels and people who are not rebels, people who are not referred to as rebels. The most successful rebels, in many ways, are those who are not referred to as rebels at all in the sources. And I think that's a thing that early medieval sources are often reluctant to refer to particular individuals as rebels and to use that term, a rebel or rebellion. Because early medieval rebellion is effectively about competing within an existing framework. They're not trying to dismantle the framework, but it's competition within an existing political framework in many ways. And I think by example of this, the successful dynasty of the early Middle Ages in Western Europe is the Carolingian Dynasty, here represented by Charlemagne in an early medieval, early modern image of Charlemagne looking very official and very grand, and not at all like he is the son of a king who has usurped the previous dynasty in a very dubious coup d'etat. But effectively the Carolingians were the experts in coup d'etat in the early Middle Ages, and then experts in legitimizing what they had done. Likewise, I think you could say that about the West Saxon dynasty, the West Saxon dynasty of Alfred. Alfred was descended from Egbert, and you've effectively got a branch of his dynasty who have supplanted an earlier branch of the West Saxon dynasty, which I think is also an interesting thing about the legitimization of power. I could carry on, highlight the fact that you get other dynasties in France in the 10th century, the Robertians, who eventually go on to be the family of the Capetians, who become the hallmarks of legitimacy in the Central and later Middle Ages. But there's an interesting indication of that concern for legitimacy and that concern about being seen as rebels in the words put in the mouth of Hugh Capet when he seized power in 989 in West Francia. Incidentally, Laon and the landscape around it become part of that seizure of power as well. But Hugh Capet says, those who will deny that we are defending there will be those who deny that we are defending ourselves against our enemies, and will instead defame us as rebels and perjurers who have taken up arms against our king. It's that kind of concern for how you will be perceived. And Richard of Reims, a successor of Flodois as a local chronicler, is aware of that kind of sense of reputation and the concern for the legitimacy of rebellion and a coup d'etat. And I did say there'd be an image of Alfred here. And I think it is interesting how Alfred and his family become that kind of hallmark of legitimacy. In the 19th century family tree over here on my right, I find it very interesting that the author has chosen to place the daughter of Alfred, Ælfric, and link her with Baldwin of Flanders, and thereby link the Norman conquest with the West Saxon royal family and sort of say, well, it all stems from the West Saxon royal family. It's kind of funny how you can do this sort of thing with the telling of stories about royal families, because if you tell these things often enough, they become true and people believe them. So goes the case with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a repackaging of the story of the West Saxon dynasty, making it legitimate and hiding the problems that are faced by the Robertian Capetian dynasty that kind of emerged, those problems that are happening in 10th century West Francia. So this moves me on to the final point of keeping power, because that sense of legitimacy goes then on to demonstrations of loyalty. So demonstrating loyalty is a significant part of the ways in which one can other your opposition. You can basically set your opposition up as other by showing what the idea of loyalty is in the early Middle Ages. And this is a Winchester story, basically. And it relates to the next part of the West Saxon dynasty, the Norman ducal house after 1066. And it's a Winchester story through St. Giles's Hill, which some of you who were at the Norman Conquest event in the Guildhall will have heard Leonie Hicks talk about the story of the execution of Earl Waltheof in 1076. And it's a theme which is interesting to me, not least because when I first came to Winchester for the interview for the studentship here, I went from the campus down into town, and going up to St. Giles's Hill was a wonderful opportunity to kind of get a sense of the early medieval past of Winchester, laid out there in terms of the landscape, in terms of the townscape as an early medieval city. So you can see St. Giles's Hill up there in the background on the image on a rather foggy day there. Well, Waltheof was an English earl who was caught in a treasonous plot in 1075 at a wedding feast, actually, no less. A wedding feast in Suffolk, incidentally, at a farm of one-night estate. And he was executed in Winchester in 1076. And our best account of this although it is recorded in other sources as well. Our best account, our best narrative of this is by the Norman writer, or I should say the Anglo-Norman writer, because his mother was English, Ælfric Vitalis, writing in Normandy in the early 12th century. And he says about the execution of Waltheof being just outside the city walls on St. Giles's Hill to the east of the city. There is another source, which I think is brilliant, and I acknowledge the work of Barbara York in drawing attention to the significance of pageants and commemorations. And for a few years, we had a research student here, Carl Alverstad, who's gone back to Norway. He's not here this evening. There's a lot of people not here that I'm mentioning. But Carl also studied commemoration in Norway, and it really sort of opened my mind to the ways in which commemoration and pageant opens up windows onto modern society's interpretations of the early Middle Ages. And no doubt you've had the chance to read this, but I just love this kind of that I, the last of Englishmen, should fall by the churl axe of headmen for a wife. You know, there's no misogyny there, is there? This is the last of Senlac field. My death, great Harold, had I died with thee at the Battle of Hastings. I think he wasn't there, and he may have actually been too young to do so. But anyway, the story is not about ethnicity. It's not about him being English. It's got other issues associated with it. And Waltheof was part of a new generation of post-1066 earls, and he'd lost power. He'd lost power that he should have inherited from his father. And it was Chris Lewis, who's kindly come here this evening to hear this. Chris Lewis drew attention to this a number of years ago, I recall, in a really good article on the post-conquest earls of England. And that sort of sense of displacement and disgruntlement, I think, lies at the heart of Waltheof and his co-conspirators' actions. There's a broader context. His co-conspirators are a Norman, who is called Roger the Norman, and Ralph, who is a Breton. And basically, seen through the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles filter, this is a story of the subversion of lordship. The subversion of lordship. So the Chronicle has this kind of poem on this topic. There was that bryd Ealo, that was menigra manna Bealo. Some were blinded and some were exiled from the land, and some reduced to ignominy. So talking about the tragedy of the wedding feast. It's poetic, basically, and it's reflecting on that in poetic terms. There is another source, the letters of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Italian Norman Ælfric, where he's basically writing to one of the co-conspirators, Earl Roger de Breteuil, and is urging him. You've kind of got the three warnings. This is very parenty, basically. The three warnings. I urge you. I beg you. Right, that's it. You're excommunicated. So the kind of three stages of warnings are going on here. Roger got it easy. Well, he may have been excommunicated, but he ended up being imprisoned. He lost his land. The Breton Earl Ralph was exiled. Waltheof lost his head. He was beheaded in May 1076 after an imprisonment probably at the royal castle in Winchester. And this is probably about legal differences. Orderic is less interested, I think, in the legal differences, and makes less of the legal differences than drawing attention to the presence of St. Giles, abbot and confessor. And St. Giles is known in the Middle Ages for the confessing of an unspeakable sin by the Emperor Charlemagne that could be spoken only to God through St. Giles's intercession. That's what he's famous for in the 11th century when the story comes to England. Orderic's not averse to making a few things up for his story, and I wonder whether he's equating the stories of unspeakable sin with stories of unspeakable sin for William in the execution of Waltheof. Well, maybe. But I think there's other things going on here in terms of this as a significant place. This was an important place in terms of the local topography here from Martin Biddle and Derek Keene's map of Winchester. The hill was already known as was perhaps already important as the site of an annual fair, and the origins are granted to the Bishop of Winchester in 1096 as if the fair were his own. So there's a kind of sense of royal jurisdiction over that site. And Orderic describes the execution party trying to get on with their task at the crack of dawn whilst the people slept, so as not to raise public clamour, so as not to wake people up. But the shortest route is down from the castle, along the high street, out through the East Gate, stopping off for a piece of cake at the cafe, very nice place there, and heading straight up St. Giles's Hill. That's the shortest route to get there. It's not exactly a way of avoiding raising clamour at that site. Well, now the site, the side of the hill is quite steep, but it had been there had been lime quarrying in the 19th century and earlier, and I think with a gentler slope, access up the hill would have been a lot more direct. So it's not exactly the way to quietly dispose of the Earl. And what you've also got is a deliberate, deliberate departure from local custom of execution in the city, because other sites are north of Winchester at Harestock, and there's evidence of executions, Anglo-Saxon period executions at Harestock to the north of Winchester, and the recent findings in Oliver's Battery, the execution site in Oliver's Battery to the south of Winchester. So it shows that there's not just one site of execution in early medieval Winchester, that you've got these places around the city. And St. Giles's Hill is intervisible with the rest of the city. And the tree cover on St. Giles's Hill, and I'm very grateful to Mark Allen for this information actually, the tree cover on St. Giles's Hill is a product of the period after the fairs on the hill have ended. So a kind of early 20th century phenomenon. So here you can see the Chesil railway station there with the hill quite visible in the early 20th century. So it's an open space and it's a visible space. Public viewing is expected within that site. And I think that is part of what's going on in the theatre of keeping power and that theatre of demonstrating legitimacy in the early Middle Ages for William. He's using that local landscape, that landscape of what is legitimate in order to demonstrate his authority against a rebel. So you often get that sort of response of coming down as hard as possible on rebels in the early Middle Ages, and I think that is one of those cases. And incidentally, I think city spaces within cities are places where the kind of theatricality of things like this matter because they are remembered. They are linked with the memory of the place. I don't think we have much of the memory of the execution of Waltheof going on St. Giles's Hill now, but I think through the Middle Ages this was part of the local memory of the site. So, to finish, the choice of places, figures in the period choose their actions carefully, and the spaces for them they choose carefully too. They're not just random batterings and conflicts, but they're thought through, presumably thinking about opposition, potential opposition, and how their actions are going to be seen by others. There is, of course, a practical element to this, as I am reminded. Castle gives protection. You choose a big field if you've got a big army to have a big battle. These are practical things. But I think to return to the story of William the Conqueror and the rebellion at Arc-la-Bataille, there is an interesting line in the account of the conflict by the apologist for William the Conqueror, also called William of Poitiers, who was very much on the side of Duke William. And he dismisses this. He dismisses this place as this lair, this rampart of earthly pride and madness. How you have a lair and a rampart in the same place, I'm not quite sure, because surely it's one or the other. But William of Poitiers might disapprove of pride. As a clerical writer, one is meant to disapprove of pride. But a line like that is important, and it gives us an insight, and I think this is something that helps us to understand some of these conflicts. It gives us an insight into the all-too-human motivations of the political actors of the early Middle Ages. So, thank you.
Well, it falls to my lot to thank Ryan formally on behalf of you all. Ryan has both informed and entertained us. And this is very typical of his whole academic career, an attitude to history, very high standards of research, but wanting to share them with as many people as possible and making his subject accessible through his enthusiastic delivery, very clear delivery, and wonderful slides that bring everything to life. Ryan has worn his learning lightly tonight, but behind the lecture there has been much hard work, examination of text, rethinking of texts, and throwing new light on them, both by the comparisons he has drawn between events in England and events in France, and thinking about their landscape context and how that can be interpreted. Those of you who are in the academic world will appreciate just how difficult it is to begin a new area of research, as Ryan has done, and to bring it to a conclusion with a forthcoming book. Not that Ryan has shut himself away in a book-lined study while he has been doing his work. As many of you will have found out, he pops up all over the country, if not on our television screens, spreading the word about how fascinating early medieval history can be, setting people right on some of their delusions about the past, adding to stimulating debates. And amongst the places, of course, that have benefited from Ryan's insight and enthusiasm is Winchester. And it's very fitting that he should have ended his talk today by discussing perhaps a little known but important incident in Winchester, and so showing us how much more there is still to learn. And I know that many of you who are here tonight have benefited from Ryan's work around Winchester, the many lectures he has given, and the seminars and conferences that he has organised. All these are part of his work as a busy academic, and as he's reminded us, as a family man, very much involved with his family, though we noticed that even that provided him with raw material for his lecture. So it just remains to me to ask you all to congratulate Ryan on his lecture this evening and to his much-deserved promotion to the position of Professor.